In specialty healthcare, growth is not optional, but scaling with operational excellence, that's the hard part. I'm Joe Zboch. This is Scaling Specialty Growth. Welcome to the first episode of Scaling Specialty Growth. I'm your host, Joe Zboch. Today's guest is our very own Chris Poole, CEO of Hatch. He's a healthcare industry veteran with time in venture capital, health system innovation, and as a three-time healthcare CEO. So, well, really, he's the perfect person to dive into some of the scaling challenges specialty operators are facing. At Hatch, we help specialty orgs modernize their referral workflows. So we are constantly having conversations with operations and access leaders that are responsible for the systems required to scale growth. Chris, episode 1, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to get started.
Yeah, man. Let's just dive right into it from a macro level. What are we hearing time and time again? What are specialty orgs facing today?
I mean, I think a lot of what they're facing at the macro level is the things that they've been contending with probably since COVID. I think ultimately the focus is on growth. I think growth is not just about, the profitability per se of a practice, but the sustainability of it. And you look at sort of the face of some of the things occurring in healthcare. I mean, on the finance side, we often talk about margin compression, which is just really a fancy way of categorizing kind of rising cost and shrinking reimbursements. And I think
your background is finance, right?
Or it is. Yeah, it is. I started as an accountant and then, moved into venture investing and did that for a number of years. So sometimes I'll use terms that are more finance terms than operator, but I like to think I have experience on both sides of the table. But yeah, I mean, coming back, you've got rising costs. Obviously, labor is one. But at the same time, you've got, sort of a myriad of expectations from the market as it relates to sort of contending with payers, consumer expectations, staying on the cusp of innovation from a clinical perspective. And so practices contend with, in some ways, what you might consider an insurmountable amount of increasing cost. And at the same time, shrinking reimbursements, which has largely been a trend over probably the past several decades within healthcare. And that's probably further complicated by the fact that you have a lot of these new value-based care models coming to market that are kind of disrupting maybe the natural flow of patients. And so it's a difficult operating environment. I think this is certainly true within specialty care, but I think it extends beyond that. Having spent time at 2 hospitals, looking at innovation. I mean, one of the things we were constantly contending with was rising costs. So it's a difficult operating environment for a specialty practice.
So this show, obviously, Scaling Specialty Growth is not optional. Why is that, right? So you've talked about the cost side of things and how that's almost becoming insurmountable and that's going up and up. Is that what makes the kind of the growth imperative just not optional? Tell me a little bit about growth.
Well, I mean, it's critical to sustainability, right? I mean, in terms of you need to continue to grow patient volumes to help offset rising cost. But it's not just simply growing that top line. It's also, in many respects, about optimizing within the business to minimize that sort of expense side of operating a practice. And, the better that a practice is able to do that, the more they're able to continue to sustain themselves. And, depending on the type of practice, if it's physician owned, it continues to allow them to operate in that capacity. So it's really about looking at, yes, top line growth and how do you increase volume, but also how do you increase the value, the yield of a patient. And, you can do that a number of different ways, but operational cost and bringing those down, managing those more successfully is certainly one of the tactics that, we talk to a lot of practices about.
I don't know if it's a finance word, but let's double click on the word yield a little bit. I feel like I'm hearing that more and more in the conversations we're having with leaders in the market. What's the simple equation of yield? Because I feel like it encapsulates both the growth and cost components of kind of this formula.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of what is the actual value of a particular patient, whether it's payer related, whether it's the type of patient care, the type of care the patient needs, and then what are the costs and complexities of servicing that patient. And so, it's no different than I think a lot of other industries. Frankly, I mean, you could look at the airline industry, fairly commoditized offering, yet you've got different classes within a plane, and that sort of helps optimize revenues and drives profitability in an industry that oftentimes is undifferentiated in terms of one airliner compared to the other. Mm-hmm. And so as a practice, I think, and as a health system, I mean, we talked about this a lot within the two health systems I worked for, which is where do we have our best patient yield? And I don't know that means that, all patients aren't created equal. They certainly are, and you want to provide care to those. But being cognizant of where those high yield patients are can make the difference in terms of a practice's, financial health. And so, your ability to identify who those patients are and to manage those accordingly can make a big impact on the performance of a practice.
Okay, so we talked about the macro environment in terms of cost, in terms of growth, and then yield being this idea that brings them together. So what are orgs trying to do in this environment?
Yeah, you see a lot of different things. Certainly, there's a subset of providers that are exploring sort of the value-based care pathway. That means different things to different providers. It could be on one end of the spectrum, completely at risk. On the other, maybe you have bundled pricing arrangements in the marketplace. But the real crux of it is, how do you cast a wide net in terms of where you can acquire patients? I think beyond that, it's also looking at things like diversifying your reimbursement streams. So, you're looking at ancillary services. This is something that practices have been expanding into for a number of years. And I think in some respects, which of those services bear fruit versus others becomes critical in terms of you can't do everything. So you got to be thoughtful about which ones that you choose to invest in and grow. But ultimately, it's a function of, yes, volume, but also yield. For some, I think we talked to, if volumes are fairly strong, they lean a bit more into yield. If your volumes aren't where you want them to be, then you're more in a mindset of, we'll take most of any patients that we can get. So it depends on the practice in terms of the more nuanced, what I would think of as like micro level dynamics within their particular marketplace, and that driving some of the decisions they make in that respect.
Let's talk a little bit about differentiation. So you kicked off the episode saying, on the coattails of COVID, there's been a lot of focus around differentiation, around innovation, and that has driven. I remember, I've been in digital health for over a decade now. There was a lot of innovation and acceleration that happened during the COVID years because I think a lot of practices, a lot of systems were kind of caught not able to meet the moment. And so there's a lot of investment in technology and rapid rollout of new things that really put, quite frankly, the patient experience into the phone, right? To where they could act on their behalf, be their own advocate. And so in a lot of ways, differentiation historically has meant being, digital first, and then giving patients control. How has that evolved? I think, in our conversations, the term differentiation can mean a lot of different things. It's an obscure term in some ways. What's your take on that?
Beyond healthcare, I think differentiation in other industries could be things like the specific set of offerings that you bring to market. It could be price. It could be convenience. I think what I will say is that almost all groups that we talk to feel very confident about their clinical differentiation. But I think a subset of the market, particularly patients, don't know how to distinguish between quality from one group to the other. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of, talk and innovation within that space. Certainly as it relates to price transparency, that too has been a focal point of innovation over the last decade or so. But these things generally aren't always at the forefront of the consumer's mind, particularly if they're being referred, for example, by a physician who's sort of, championing or guiding that patient's care journey. Beyond that, I think what you often see is a differentiation through convenience. And I think this is something that's relatively new within healthcare. We have seen like the brick and mortar differentiation in terms of, do you have a clinic in an area that's convenient to me? I don't want to drive across the interstate, for example. And so, how do you think about where you place your clinics? And I think there's been some advancements in the ability to garner insights to inform location selection. But there's a lot of groups that, still are challenged with, really knowing and having evidence of where to place a particular clinic. If you think about orthopedics, you're seeing the emergence of a lot of ortho urgent cares. Great idea, by the way. I think it makes a ton of sense. But the question is, how do you determine what specific site? in, during time I spent in business school, we did some case studies on companies like Starbucks, and the amount of research and insights that drive their location selection is frankly profound when you think about it simply being a cup of coffee. But I think, that should be present too within specialty care. Beyond brick and mortar, I think about the overall experience of coming into the practice. And then obviously, as you progress through that care journey with your specialist. And so, it could be a lot of different things, obviously, starting from how was the referral experience to when I get to the site of care, how's check-in, how's the communication along the way? If I have questions, how easy is it for me to access that practice? Am I calling a call tree and sitting on the phone for an hour? That's not a great experience. And I think as we see sort of the evolution of society in terms of expectations of convenience and wanting things to be sort of instantly available, that will continue to grow. And those consumer expectations and preferences will, I think, have a lot of impact on a practice's ability to acquire and grow their practice.
You're getting to the crux of the show and a really, really important idea of we have, as an organization, aggressive growth goals, and we have an operations team that's responsible for implementing them. And the challenge being hitting those goals while maintaining that operational excellence and like a really great patient experience, right? So there's this kind of diversifying where patients are coming from, meeting them where they are in the market, whether that's brick and mortar or convenient digital experiences. Tell me about the challenges or the struggles that these teams are facing when they go through this. Obviously, a great way to think about this is the people, the process, the technology. Can you share a little bit about what you see those challenges being?
Within the practice, I think a couple of things. Like one, this is a bit self-serving for Hatch, but the one thing that I will say is that we've invested in a lot of money via innovation in improving what I would say is the operational sort of the clinical care path. EHRs aren't great. They're certainly better than they were. We've got a lot of other tools, practice management tools, et cetera, that teams are using. But the reality is that I think that front door, top of funnel for a practice in terms of patients is very, very much still fragmented. And frankly, I would argue that it deserves as much focus and attention as anywhere else in the practice. You can have all the great rev cycle tools and teams. You can have the best physicians in the area. You can have the great sort of EHR tools or these ambient, note-taking tools that sort of, simplify and improve the physician's job. But if you don't know how to get patients through the door and optimize that top of funnel, you're sort of putting the cart before the horse in some respects, in my eyes. And so the orchestration of patients moving through the practice is what we often refer to at Hatch as a miracle. If you look at the number of people involved and what they need to remember and the types of tools they need to leverage, it's still very, frankly, antiquated and lacks, I think, sophistication to ensure that all of the other things that practice invest in, great clinical care, or orthopedic urgent cares, et cetera, physician liaisons. The list goes on. You can optimize there, but it really doesn't sort of come full circle until you understand how patients move into the top of the funnel and through that top piece within your practice.
I think historically, you've been able to kind of throw bodies at a lot of these problems, right? The manual tasks, the error prone, the burnout, inefficiencies. I can't cite the exact source, but there's a chart that I've seen just that the rise in providers versus the rise in administrators in healthcare, just like huge divergence over time. And so clearly unsustainable in terms of the people side of scaling and meeting the kind of the operational moment. So my question is really, quite frankly, like what needs to change? You touched on the tools, you've touched on some of the process in your mind to change to really scale specialty growth in a way that is sustainable.
That's a great question. There's a couple different angles that you could come at. I think one is we are big proponents of practices really developing a brand and delivering on that brand promise, tried and true strategy for a number of other industries as it relates to sort of differentiation and really kind of fortifying one's existence. I think beyond that, It is looking at how technology continues to emerge and evolve to, I think, simplify and bring down the cost of areas of the practice where we sort of think of the lift being undifferentiated. We talked about this a lot within the health systems. The patients want to know the physicians. That's where the relationship exists, and you should never replace that. Your physicians are the talent, and in many respects, you may think of it as that's the product that you bring to market that the market cares about. And so you want to keep them at the forefront of your practice. But I think you should be looking at areas within the practice where there is just inherently a lot of administrative bloat, because this generally doesn't translate to a more fortified relationship with the patient. In fact, I think the opposite happens if it's not there and in place, is that it erodes it. And so, in healthcare services, and having founded a virtual care company about a decade ago, I mean, we learned that our success was going to be very much dependent upon removing sort of administrative bloat, both in terms of the cost that it drives. Labor generally is still the biggest line item on a practice P&L, but also improving the patient experience and the referring physician experience. This is one of the dynamics, I think, that are true within specialty practices where, yes, you have the patient, but you also have a referring physician or source that you need to continue to build a relationship with too, particularly as we continue to move into more of a value-oriented type of healthcare ecosystem or ecosystem, depending on where you're from, because the payers certainly are injecting people into the equation that are influencing the patient's decisions and journey. And so, we believe strongly that your ability to fortify and strengthen those relationships with those referring groups and be able to monitor them over time is critical to building a sustainable practice.
Yeah. Clearly at a point where the solution of people and paperwork is not sustainable. The growth imperatives of here. Tell me a little bit about, you've touched on it, the referral problem. That'll be the focus of our next episode. So if you want to give a little bit of a preview as to what Hatch is doing within this corner of, overall specialty growth and scaling that and working with operational leaders.
I mean, I think a couple of things. I think the referral, let's just be honest, it's not particularly, dare I say, the most sexiest topic within healthcare. But if you really study and analyze it, there's a lot of problems and gaps and opportunities within a referral. I would say that any other, healthcare is about care first, and I fully subscribe to that, have many family members who are on the clinical side, but we all know that it also has to be run to a degree like a business. And so from that particular lens, if you think about other industries, the amount of, in this case, consumer insights that they have is at this point where technology is at probably infinite. And the referral in a lot of respects is a microcosm of information and insights that practices can glean that influence a number of things that they could do downstream. And so as we think about it, certainly at Hatch, the referral gives you the ability to garner insights about patient acquisition and how is that trending over time, and how long does it take patients to move through that process from the referral first being faxed over to them actually being scheduled, and who's sending you those referrals and what type of referrals are they sending you. Again, how does that trend over time? And furthermore, where is the leakage at? You read these reports about 50%, up to 50% of referrals never convert to appointment. We talk about this with a lot of our executive leaders at the practices that we work with. And frankly, they don't have great insights into this. And so many times we have the conversation, while you're trying to acquire more patients through, partnering with this organization or deploying a practice in this particular area of town, do you even know how many are just inherently falling through the net? And how would improving that even incrementally change your practice? And so, I think referrals, having spent, 2 decades looking at healthcare challenges and working to innovate around those, I overlooked referrals. It was never something that while I was at the health systems we thought about from a place of innovation. And so, the time we spent here at Hatch working with our groups, it's very clear that managed correctly, it becomes as critical a piece of the business from a strategic standpoint as anything else.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got another episode coming up where we're going to deep dive into the Hatch side of things. I appreciate you doing this first episode about the kind of the macro challenges with scaling specialty growth and what the job of the operation and access leader is going to be in order to meet those goals in this environment. So next episode is all about diving into Hatch, and we'll see you there. Hey, it's Joe. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, share with a peer. And if you're looking to scale referral operations to drive growth and efficiency, visit hatchcare.com.